Hello, everyone. My name is John Desjardins. I'm the Executive Director of the Indigenous Resource Network, and you're listening to the Indigenous Voices in Resource Development podcast. On this episode, you'll hear from Isaiah Robinson. Yay! So, Isaiah is the Deputy Chief Councillor from Kitasoo Xai'xais. How's that? Yeah, right on. Yes, Nation, and the CEO, Chief Executive Officer of the Kitasoo Development Corporation. So Isaiah focuses on supporting, growing, and advocating for Kitasoo Xai'xais Nation, with key industries like aquaculture and forestry being the catalyst for steady success and growth within the community. But before we jump into, kind of the anything professional or anything like that, we love to get to know the person and start from that relational context. We want to know a little bit about you, your background, where you're from, those kinship ties, your community, and that extended community, of course. So, where are you from?
Yeah, so Isaiah Robinson, I've lived in Klemtu or Kitasoo Xai'xais territory for the last 8 years. Prior to that, I actually lived in the Fraser Valley throughout British Columbia. And so
Mhm.
prior to coming back home, I uh, finished school, just did some work, did have had some more professional development type work done within those workplaces I was in. And then from there, really became interested in going back home, supporting my community. With those work experiences I did have, it was primarily around business
Mhm.
development. And so I did housing and public works when I got back, did that for 5 years. And now my third year as a member of the Development Corporation. So my business background really came through after being home for quite some time. So my plan is to continue pushing and growing more businesses within the community, within the territory also.
Oh, that's awesome. I know, like, we first got, you came on the radar, and I was incredibly inspired by the work that you do. You were fearless in standing up for your community, what it was doing, which, some people viewed in contrast to policy and things like that. But, an incredible story. And one of the things I want to, like, we love talking about is, why people go home, right? And so, or why do people, pivot and then have this, or have to complement a professional experience with community service and community experience. And we'll talk about that later. But, what were some of the, you talked a little bit about your career. What were some of the highlights, some of the things that you're, I think, most proud about?
Well, with recently, obviously, there's a lot of work that the council has been doing. I would say
Mhm.
there's been many stewardship initiatives that the nation has been able to do. Getting certain awards, doing well in
Mhm.
other circuits, be it film,
Mhm.
um, and just doing well. I would say internally, I think we're going the right direction. Like many of you would hear in general, the story of the Kitasuos and Kitasoo Xai'xais, we do have a very high unemployment rate. So, it makes for a difficult situation, more so than general because it's not often you run out of people you can hire. So
Mhm.
it's an interesting situation. I would say we're very proud, but it's how do we keep growing from there? So yeah, there's lots of successes, but there's also lots to do too in the end.
Absolutely. And so, what drives you? What motivates you in your work?
Well, I think just like you were saying earlier, that kingship, that the reason why I came home was to really, really be that change maker for the community. There needs to be, more push from new generations that are coming to really try to support the community. The old
Mhm.
guards are slowly fading away, and there still needs to be new people to start trying to lead and support the nations as best as possible. And that was really my big thing: is how can I serve the community, my community, the best as I
Mhm.
possibly could, and how am I going to be present and to try to support them. So that's always been my really big thing: is just to continue to give back, to continue to support, and driving this nation forward in a way that's proactive in the end.
That's awesome. You talked about, there's some things I can kind of reading between the lines here, but you go off, you learn things, you get an education and whatnot, you learn new tools, new tactics, understand new ways of doing business, and you have this desire to bring not just to serve, but to bring some of these things back home. What were some of the challenges that you faced in terms of coming back and then serving, if any?
Well, I think there's always many challenges. I think, I came from living off reserve for a significant amount of my life, right? So I came back
Mhm.
from, visiting a community every summer to now living here. And so there's a very different dynamic what you have to deal with living within your community, being lateral violence to drama, to all these things. And I've been very blessed that I don't have to deal with really any of those per se.
Yeah.
But there's still the angst of just the crab in the bucket's very prominent. But it's just what I struggle with is seeing how our people struggle and how they handle these things. And so, um, I tell and I tease myself in general that I decided to choose the worst job first before moving back home, and that was housing and public works. So who decides to come back home and do housing? So I put myself on the hot seat in a sense of trying to ensure that I'm able to force myself to help my people as best as possible in that admin role. And
Mhm.
it was a very good experience to that extent. And there's tons of abilities that the struggle is being prominent and ensuring that our membership are able to try to follow and are able to try to listen, even though we're such a small community. There's still always that minor dysfunctionality we have to deal with when it comes to
Mhm.
crabs in the bucket and so on. So I think those are prominent issues that many would have to face coming onto reserve and living so remotely too.
Yeah, absolutely. You got both those challenges, right? And so moving home on reserve and living remotely. And so that's incredible. And then yeah, that crab in the bucket mentality and and you touched on it there. There's so many, our communities are dealing with like abject poverty and people understand the physical poverty. They understand, being kind of that kind of cash poor, right? But they don't understand that there's all these other socioeconomic factors in terms of health and education and everything like that. And so here we are, and here you are trying to economic develop, trying to lead, and also managing a lot of these different realities, right? And so, which again, a lot of people shake their head. Why do people come home, right? Now, it reminds me of this little story. Someone asked me, I said, I wanted to move back to Cumberland House. And they thought that was bizarre. They thought that was going backwards, which I thought, no, it's quite the opposite. I've learned new things and I can go and help the community and I don't want to leave it behind. So they didn't understand that I didn't see the world. I didn't see, myself as kind of the only person in this world and my path and everything, but I saw the community around and everything, and I was part of that. And that was, I think, a lesson certainly for this certain individual. And I love hearing some of those parallels, right? And so incredibly exciting. And for the community, and it's wonderful that you're doing there. We'll pivot gears a little bit here, and then we'll kind of come back to community again. But of course, we know about the government's recent decision on banning open net pen salmon aquaculture in BC coastal waters. So let's discuss that. What can you tell me about that? I think it's by June 30th, 2029, so it gives kind of a date. So what's your perspective or fears, angst and everything like that? What does people don't understand in terms of, setting some of these policy dates without understanding its impacts?
Well, it's a good discussion, I think. Just trying to understand how this came to fruition and its overall development. This overall transition was, in our perspective, a lot different from what we understood. What
Mhm.
we were sold in the beginning, and we were
Mhm.
sold that we would develop transition plans and that they would then be implemented into said transition document that the government was going to create with us. And so now they've kind of they've been really pushing against and making it clear that certain mandates that they've made over the last decade that they've
Mhm.
been in government need to follow through. And so this is
Mhm.
one of them. And I've made some very strong statements in regards to certain groups that are definitely pushing against this, and there are many groups that push against First Nations thoughts, be it NGOs or other groups in that sense. So, this was really, um, you know, it, I would say overall, it took some time to get to this point, and it didn't obviously go the way we wanted, but we do still see hope. We still see that there's opportunity for us to define what the overall definition of close containment is. And that gives us a clear enough understanding on how we can operate. For us, we've been in this partnership for over 25 years now. With Mowi Canada West, and it's integral that we continue operating with these partnerships. So it's just continuing to wordsmith and ensure that yes, there's this quote unquote banning, but it also the closed containment hasn't been defined yet, which gives us a runway to kind of define how we can move forward in a way that's proactive enough for ourselves and our partners too.
Absolutely. And there's some important highlights there that you've had the opportunity to interject and define what some of these definitions and what these policy, what good policy implementation looks like. I think that's one of the consistent challenges we hear within IRN is that, far too often, policies developed without input from our community, meaningful input from our communities in terms of its design. And then, in its application and its evaluation, and huge issues there, right? And that's one of the things that's always been a struggle. There's important environmental policies in terms of transition, and this, of course, this spills into a lot of different industries. That absolutely we need to think about how we do and redefine and do different, but it's almost like a transformation, not so much a transition, right? And so how do we transform impact, sustainability, as opposed to transition? It's a different mentality, whereas we're leaving one behind, we're going to jump into the other, and then we'll kind of figure it out. And then who's having to figure it out without all the tools? A lot of our communities, which is a huge challenge. So, what does advocacy in fish farming look like going forward?
Ooh, advocacy. I think there's multifaceted communication strategies we are discussing at this point because when it comes down to this industry, it's taken 30 years to get to the point where to say, well, okay, maybe we should start trying to communicate this important information about science, about the overall environmental management, stuff like that. And the big push now is to start to generate to educate the public on the general information that is about this industry, and try to explain that some of the science is being pushed and sold, and that multimillionaires and philanthropists and actors are selling to people, right? And that it isn't the case. And so that's we're fighting a giant in our perspective because the amount of resources they have compared to us is astronomical. So there's a big push obviously to have good communications with BC members of the general public to explain what this is about. And that's also in pushing industry and pushing the government to ensure that that there is an understanding of what the science we do does make sense and so on. So there's large scale discussions that we're going to have to explain some of these things because the lack of communication, in my perspective, has been the failure of this industry, and that's it's put us in this position where we're at now. And so we're recovering, but if we did our job better, I would say that we wouldn't be recovering as hard as we are right now.
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why, we're pretty excited to see your organization stand up. One of the reasons why we stood up the network is because, like, just that, what we're finding is that good Indigenous leadership and good, meaningful Indigenous participation is innovating and driving these industries forward. That is, I think that is challenging some of those industry stereotypes of the past. And there's some pretty poor practices in the past, and maybe in other places in the world and things like that, but to be painted kind of with that same brush, especially when a lot of these communities are so involved, so integrated, and doing things in much more meaningful ways. It's tough to receive that type of criticism and that type of negative advocacy in terms of what we're doing, because you don't feel we're doing things different, feel like we're doing things well. And there's also, kind of that community balance in terms of managing, moving these communities forward, supporting transition, diversifying, all those type of things, and then, that are pillared on a lot of these industries that have supported them for so long. That's incredibly important. The other thing, I think this is in line with kind of some of the previous questioning, but one thing we've come to celebrate is that Indigenous knowledge and land stewardship are playing a vital role in how we think about sustainability and resource management. How do you see this knowledge being integrated and valued within the industry?
I think that's a good question. I think, within the coalition, these many First Nations that are part of it, I would say, do have stewardship departments, and typically, there's lots of due diligence and trying to understand how industry is there and how they present. And many of them actually make industry really support them, be it provide programs, other initiatives. And so I would say stewardship is so integrally important to First Nations communities itself. It's just how they present themselves and how they're present within their partnerships, and how that they understand that they're an arm of the council to then support these decisions to either have industry or how they work with industry themselves too, right? So I think there's tons of potential. I know that there's other, like I said, um, industry, I think would say they're also very pliable, and they're willing to understand, and they're willing to put money into these things. And recently for us, there's always been this push around wild stock, and there's always been this big issue with wild stock. We've been working with industry already to help try to rebuild the wild stock within our territory. It's not rocket science. Who can help better to help bring fish back than the aquaculture industry itself? So there's stuff like that stewardship is very important, and it's just how it's managed and what's being done. And the main thing with stewardship is for them to continue pushing the envelope, to continue pushing initiatives within the community, um, because science doesn't always remain the same, and there's always stuff that could be getting done too. So stewardship for us is very important.
Yeah.
And it's, for us, it's at the forefront of many decision making. So we do decide in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is consistently what we hear. A lot of times, people don't understand, like in terms of business, you go in, and then you create these kind of economies. But I think what's starting to be understood by, the public, the Canadian public, and even past that, is that, we have special rights and privileges. I don't even want to call it privilege. We have rights that are tied to our territories, and we want to be able to live, in some measure. We want to be able to self-determine, decide. And so, and we want to be able to, fish the way we fished. We want to be able to hunt the way we've hunt, for, in perpetuity. And so when we think about stewardship and sustainability, it's through that lens. And I think that's a different way of thinking. I think we're reconciling with businesses. We're taking longer terms in terms of business development growth. We're looking at things a little bit differently, which is, I think one of the ways that Indigenous people really influence industry, right? So, I think you spoke a little bit about this already, but maybe you can add to it. And this is what I was talking about. So, economic development. How do we balance economic development with the preservation of, cultural heritage and stewardship and environmental practice, right? And so, what's your take on it? How do we balance that?
You're
How do we
asking
make
wicked questions
right? Yeah, yeah,
within
no
within
doubt.
within communities, right? Like that to
Right?
me,
Yeah,
that's a big discussion. And
yeah,
what are we willing to sacrifice, and what aren't
yeah,
we willing to sacrifice?
yeah.
And for Kitasoo, for example, I would say we're at the forefront of balance within the community. Our stewardship is world renowned and recognized
Yeah.
significantly for the work we're doing. We're recognized for these park awards we're getting, but on the economic side, we're known for aquaculture, and we're known to be the the black swan to some extent because of that situation, right? So,
Yeah.
it creates an interesting dynamic because just like I said, or I haven't said it, some First Nations or some community members don't agree with me whatsoever, right? So how do you find that balance between, appeasing them to what are your concerns and how can we address them? And some of them may say the science doesn't make sense or this or that, or they just don't care. Um, but to me, balance is ensuring that we actually have resources that are multi-generational. Kitasoo, why I say Kitasoo at the forefront is because we protected over half of our territory. 52% of it's been protected, and will never be touched, not in this generation. And so for us, we have that guarantee that our territory will always be secure, right?
Mhm.
And so no, nothing, there will be no extraction whatsoever within that 52%.
Mhm.
And so that's one thing that's how we're able to balance it out. And that's some of my
Mhm.
arguments is, well, we've secured our territory, so why
Yeah.
cannot we have access to certain other areas? And so there's multi-layers, I would say, and it's
Mhm.
a complex question. And Kitasoo's is a good situation because we have secured area and we don't have to worry about it. But there's still balance, and there's always us trying to push for more science and more understanding and more
Mhm.
regulation. Is that beneficial for economics sometimes? Not really, because you're adding layers and it's a death of a
Mhm.
thousand cuts. But it's how
Mhm.
do you balance both of those? And so I would say it's hard to find a sweet spot, but it's there. And
Yeah.
it's just how you're willing to work with industry and if your partners are
Mhm.
willing to be pliable and
Yeah.
if you're able to do good stewardship in a way that's not going to be too much of a hindrance in the end too. So
Mhm.
it's possible. It's very complex, and I think it's a wicked question too in the end.
It is. Yeah, it is. It is very like it is wicked and it's incredibly complex. And I think a lot of communities are achieving measures of balance because one of the I think added complications is that people don't understand in that balance there's other things that we're trying to balance as well too that take resources, that take fiscal means, right? And so we mentioned some of those socioeconomic realities that we can't address through stewardship and cultural preservation. They're very important pieces to that. But I mean, other aspects we need, we need, to create other forms of livelihood in a modern economy. We need to create, and support education and support some of those health disparities, some of the mental health issues and things like that. And so we need resources to do that. And so the balance is much bigger than that, right? And so I think, and communities understand that. Leaders like yourself understand that. And, we can hear that. So um, the other thing I love to ask is and one of the things that was important for us at the network is that there's so many misconceptions and stereotypes of Indigenous people working in resource development. Have you ever encountered any yourself? Any of those misconceptions or stereotypes in working in the sector, working in fisheries, working in agriculture? And if so, how did you address them?
In what way? In what way are you referring to this?
Well, one of the ways I think you talked about it in terms of balance, one of the things I get often, I've worked in the resource industry for quite some
Hmm.
time, and I'm told I'm a sellout.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, that's one of the biggest things. I actually entered into industry as an environmental professional,
Mhm.
and so with an interest, that I wanted to influence in that way, right? And never in my journey did I ever felt that I ever compromised on my indigeneity or my integrity. And I got to influence and do things and everything like that. And I felt
Mhm.
I was more of a realist and a pragmatist than anything. And I still very much connected to my community, my culture, in terms of our connection to the land and the practices. That was one of the stereotypes, that I struggle with.
Mhm.
I think the biggest one, right? Are we selling out as we engage in resource development? And you might have answered a little bit, and maybe more than that, with the balance question. But what do you tell people that what do you tell those naysayers that don't believe in industry? You know,
Well,
yourself.
when it comes to the naysayers in that sense, we're not going to go like we're in the modern era. That's one part of this. And the other part, I think, it's a complex situation. We all got to survive. And I
Yeah.
think that's the big piece. And the overall issue of being a sellout, like, though that was several eras ago in my perspective, that it may have been a thing, but reconciliation wasn't even a thing. I think there's
Hmm.
we're at a different situation right now, and there's certain expectations, if we are Indigenous people being a liaison, or some other person that's supporting engaging with First Nations, there is expectations for us to build relationships, to understand them, and there is to create partnerships. But that sellout type discussion is, early 2000s to late 90s, I would say,
Hmm.
just in general. And we deal with that constantly when it comes to the aquaculture industry. We're constantly called
Hmm.
sellouts. And if I
Hmm.
had a new truck and I had a nice house, there'd be a
Hmm.
completely different situation. But even that's not a thing anymore in my perspective.
Hmm.
Within this industry, I don't know about
Hmm.
other industries. I've heard other stories, horror
Hmm.
stories of First Nations people working in banks and just not caring about First Nations
Hmm.
communities. So there is stuff still out there,
Yeah.
but within the industry circles I've been able to work with, all of us have the same values, to some
Yeah.
extent, right? When it comes to
Yeah.
supporting community, we all come from, generations of trauma too. So,
Hmm.
we all have an understanding of what our people have gone through to some extent, right? So,
Hmm.
but it's a
And
struggle.
it is. I absolutely love your response, and I had a conversation earlier today, which is very much in line with that. You know, there was people who first entered this industry, entered the different industries, in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different capacities, and a lot of them had to essentially assimilate, right? And I don't hold no fault. Like, I mean, to integrate, to get involved, to do things. I think indigeneity and who we are, we weren't self-determining like we are now. I think it's very different now. I think, it's hard to argue that anyone is selling out anymore, because you see so many incredible examples of people self-determining and walking those lines and advancing stewardship while advancing economic development. I think we had a different view in the past. I think communities, we had this romantic view that we couldn't own these industries and we couldn't participate and lead them, like they were two different things. But as we see the integration of them now, and then as they transform, it's a very different thing, right? And so it's
Yeah.
less selling out, it's more leadership than anything, right? So.
And I think it really depends on the industry. It really depends on what the
Mhm.
industry's goal is. Is their goal just to make a check mark? Is their goal is to, like, so it really depends. Is two parts of this, right? There's
Mhm.
how we come to be present to work with industry, but it's how industry is trying to wanting to engage with First Nations and what's their goal. And so
Mhm.
there's multifaceted, complex parts to this problem First Nations people have to deal with when it comes to working with industry, just in general, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, absolutely. And not even within, like, there's industry as a whole, but then there's organizations of different sizes, and what's their intent and what's their culture around reconciliation, what's their culture around engagement, right? Very different. Um, the other thing, I always like talking to leaders like yourselves. I'm always super interested and fascinated, in some of those, I think, more operational, tactical things, a little less industry. But one of the things we always love to say, and that really informs our perspective on what good looks like, is talking to people like yourself. And so when you're talking about not necessarily specific to the industry, but when you're thinking recruitment of Indigenous people, what does good look like? And we'll call this a little bit rapid fire, or whatever you want to call it, or whatever, but just maybe a minute or two. But what does good look like on recruitment of Indigenous people?
Ooh, but I've actually hired my first Indigenous um, employees within the last year, and I wasn't like, it just worked
Mhm.
out. Obviously for me, it's extremely hard to find Indigenous people to be present, to be here.
Mhm.
It's just not
Right.
common because I'm
Yeah.
such a small organization. We're
Yeah.
growing. Actually, no, I've actually hired two the last year, so I've done well for myself so far.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but I would say, when you're so deep into work, it's hard to try to focus. And
Mhm.
sometimes you're lucky. I think building out a network of young Indigenous people is super crucial, that I've been able to do to some extent.
Yeah.
But finding them, maintaining them in this economy within this group of industry wanting more First Nations.
Yeah.
It's an interesting time. I would say for me, it's been a bit more of a struggle to find per se,
Hmm.
but I've been able to do well, it sounds like, so far this year.
Hmm.
But um, I don't think I didn't answer your question that well, but I would
Yeah.
say it's a
Yeah.
bit difficult.
It is difficult, but I think one of your advantages, and you probably already know this, is because you are Indigenous, right? And you can understand some of that context. And I think one thing we hear consistently in terms of recruitment, are we? I always laughed. I had a debate. Someone said to me, "We got to hire the best man for the job. That's my rule. That's my principle." And I was like, "Well, does it have to be a man?" No, no, it doesn't need to be a man. And I was like,
Hmm.
"Well, it's like, well, the saying is he's like the best person." And that's like, what's best? We had that discussion, right? What's best
Yeah.
for you? What's best for me? It's so subjective. And it's like, well, there's a criteria, there's a minimum criteria, but cultural fit. And I was like, so ultimately you're going to hire someone that you're comfortable with, and it's probably going to be someone of your demographic, of your background and everything like that. And so that's one thing I always, kind of hear is, if you have Indigenous people participating in that recruitment process, there's a greater chance that you'll recruit them. And you spoke to retention a little bit. Um, if you want to keep those Indigenous, what do you need to do? What does good look like in terms of retaining and maintaining, as you mentioned, Indigenous talent?
I was chatting with one of my colleagues earlier, and we were just chatting about just expectations. And I
Mm.
just said certain departments or certain operations within like the council or whatever, they
Yeah,
they they attract certain people that don't require that much. And
yeah.
I basically said to them, the Dev Corp is a lot different. The Dev Corp, we're needing high caliber people, we're needing results. I'm expecting results.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's how we're able to compete with industry in a sense
Hmm.
of certain benefits and certain
Hmm.
perks to some extent. And so that, it's really hard, I would say, in the sense of competing as such a small development corporation to compete with
Hmm.
high wages and benefits
Hmm.
and
Yeah,
packages, right? And so, but I would say it's somehow competing with that and
yeah.
somehow being competitive enough with industry to
Hmm.
some extent to get to that point. Yeah, it's such an interesting discussion because, for Kitasoo, we have such a small population, and we've chatted
Yeah,
about it quite a bit. And
yeah,
I'm of the notion of, yes, let's hire Indigenous people, let's hire local people.
yeah.
But if we don't find any, then I could care less. I want stuff
Hmm.
done no matter what. And
Yeah.
so that's also my mindset. And we've always, we've gone through this stage of let's have everyone that's a member work here. I'm like, hallelujah, great, let's do it. Let's figure this out. But if no
Yeah.
one else wants to do it, then I'm not going to wait around for stuff not to happen. So I also have that mindset. We can't just expect everyone to become a band member that's going to support us in every single way. I think that's
Yeah.
unrealistic thoughts. And so I'm really of the mindset, let's just find people that want to work, that want to be here.
Hmm.
And if they're Indigenous or they want to try to participate in the community, then I'm all for it in the end.
Hmm. Yeah, I want to take this on a bit of a tangent because you raised so many important points. I think people need to hear is that, business growth and economic development growth are important. I mean, they're they're tenants in terms of prosperity and everything like that. And one of the things we always hear is, we're hiring Indigenous, we only hire Indigenous. And, I have the same philosophy. I would love to see Indigenous talent, but and you've mentioned this, but they want to have to work and they want to have to produce. I think it's important that we manage, we manage, if there is any entitlement, we manage that, right? And so at the end of the day, nothing's really owed. We're owed opportunity, but what we do with that and how we stay is really important. Um, but yeah, I think people need to understand that, like, it's important to try to hire and then to make that local impact and hire every capable person, but it's the commitment to hire every person who wants to work, who is capable, and who will grow into those positions versus owing, we owe you jobs, because that doesn't support business growth and that doesn't support the productivity you demand and you need.
Yeah, I think it depends on industry's agreement. Obviously, sometimes with
Hmm.
with First Nations they're working with,
Hmm.
and I think sometimes it's better when it comes to partnerships right now our partners are the ones that manage our people. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
employed by the company, and so they're the ones that, like, it's hard for me to have a hard conversation. It's hard for me to
Mm-hmm.
give feedback, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so by industry taking its position and starting to give feedback and sort of coach, even for our own Spirit Bear
Yeah.
Lodge, a world-renowned lodge, we have people that are very honest. And they're
Yeah.
not from here. And
Yeah.
you give feedback, you need to be on time, you need to be presenting well.
Yeah.
People take that and start taking that into consideration and how they can start presenting themselves. And so, you know, it's a good position when you're partnered and you're working in First Nations communities, because a lot of times I myself are I struggle with it certain times because
Mm-hmm.
it's a whole dynamic we have to face in these small communities too. So it's an
Mm-hmm.
interesting type of situation of how you're able to help them grow, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they just need a big push, because we really struggle just because we have a bunch of jobs, just because we have there's always social issues I hear about in other industries. People just aren't there sometimes. They're not present.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
having a coach or having someone to push you can help quite a bit, obviously.
Absolutely. And there's another great point that you made, and I think that is an important takeaway, not just for your industry, but every other industry, is what type of, it's I'll give this anecdote. I was supporting someone who was not Indigenous and really cared for his Indigenous staff. He cared for all of his staff, but he cared for his Indigenous staff in particular. And he didn't know how to articulate, but he knew that there was additional challenges that these communities had, or that these members of these Indigenous people had. But he was also very, very stern with the staff, but fair. And they felt, I could tell that the staff knew he cared about them. And he always said, like, when and he told me, he said, when I work with other non-Indigenous supervisors, I always tell them, the Indigenous people, they respond to tough love. And I said, well, that's only true if they actually feel that you love them. I said, because you don't tell someone who doesn't care about Indigenous people to apply this type of principled approach. The instant polarization, instant pushback, instant. And I said, in my experience, so I said, I said, what you need to train these other supervisors on is your empathy. How did you understand? Why do you care for some of these things? That's the thing you need to coach. Um, and so what he found is that he loved working with Indigenous supervisors, right? And he became a coach and a mentor. But I love that point is that if there is resources there that could support Indigenous people that get it, right? Especially Indigenous people supporting other Indigenous people. I get it. I understand. I understand a lot of the challenges, right? I understand that suicide ideation is multiples higher than anywhere else. I understand. I understand extended family, we're dealing with, substance and all sorts of abuses at higher rates. I understand these things. And so I accept them. That's the truth piece. And, how do we move forward them? That's incredibly important. Um, One of the last couple questions I have is we will kind of come full circle on this. Maybe not the best place to finish, but when we talked about public policy and development and implementation, what does good look like in regards to
Ooh.
policy development as it relates to Indigenous people? Development and implementation. What does good look like?
I'm always here for consultation and proper understand. Like, a lot of these policies wouldn't be as bad as they are right now if they actually had consultation, if they had advisors, Indigenous advisors or policy advisors that understood what the implications of what it would be. So,
Hmm.
I think that's the biggest piece. But how about let's scrap all this political drama, or these things. All these decisions are always so politically charged,
Hmm.
and it really makes things hard because we do all this work and then it's all for naught because someone
Hmm.
else can really kibosh the whole thing. So, these policies are all fine and dandy. I think, when it comes down to engagement, it comes down to consultation. Um, there's a lot of strong First Nations groups out there, and it's really ensuring that you have the right professionals that are there. You don't just have the AFN because they have to be the AFN that has to be there,
Hmm.
right? Because they're not always the answer. I think we have to start being honest with some of these groups that they aren't really. helping the situation, but fueling the fire when it comes to public policy too within British Columbia or Canada in general, is my thought.
Hmm. Yeah, I think one of the challenges there in terms of development and implementation is people who don't understand whatever, the nuances of the industries or whatever they're developing policies for, right? And so, yeah, you have advisors, you have lobbyists, you have um, advocacy organizations that are pushing things, but do they understand the impacts? The community best understands, right? And there's got to be better ways to kind of facilitate good consultation, facilitate getting that
Yeah.
information out. No, that's awesome. When it comes to regulation and permitting, what does good look like as it relates to Indigenous development?
Our vision right now, specifically for aquaculture, is for us to issue the licensing, for us to
Hmm.
be the regulatory body. We see that as the best option. The government of Canada hasn't done any good for us in regards to ocean management at all. So if we can at least have some control over, the industry that's within our territory to some extent, that'd be obviously the best situation. And that's how we
Hmm.
see this probably playing out in the next 10 years, is that we take over completely. And
Hmm.
that would just probably be the optimal situation itself at this point.
Hmm. That is, we've seen examples like that in other industries where their good looks like complete ownership over regulatory, or at least where it doesn't sit under other regulatory, but sits inside, right? Sits aligned with some of those other regulatory bodies. So, good at its highest level could be regulatory authority, actual
Mhm.
permitting authority, right? And so, um, I think that's best, right? That's an incredible
Yeah.
example of best. No, that's super awesome. Um, and again, we talked about some of these kind of specifics to industry, but I want to come back to, we talked about coming home and doing
Mhm.
this work. But one of the things I like leaving in is that, I'm sure you could have been successful I know you would have been successful anywhere you went, right? But you chose to come home. And so, and I don't think we dove a little deep enough in this, but why was that? Why is that important? Why is it important to live on reserve, isolated, away from an area that, that you've spent so much time,
Mhm.
and to do the work that you're doing?
How I don't I was reflecting. I've reflected quite a bit since I finished my master's, and I've just finished my couple years working for the Dev Corp. And I've reflected significantly, and I think back to when I was in high school or in grade school in general, and a lot of the indigenous peoples that I met there really struggled, really,
Hmm.
really struggled. And to this day I thought about why was so why am I so interested in this sense to try to go back home? And I thought to myself, I don't know what my people are facing at home. I don't know if they're struggling
Hmm.
or not. How are they going to school, and how are they being present? And so
Hmm.
for me, I think the big piece is I wanted to come home and I wanted to be a champion to help them and to try to support them and help this next generation a lot to get to where they
Hmm.
need to get. And yeah, I remember that just in high school, just seeing, First Nations from Stolo and other First Nations communities from across BC, just, not coming home with, or not going to school with lunches, or not being present,
Hmm.
or just having all these issues. And I never faced those issues. I grew up off
Hmm.
reserve. I grew up in a family that, I'm half First Nations. And so,
Hmm.
my mom's a teacher. I've grown up in a place that I've been very blessed. And so
Hmm.
compared to these other homes, I know that they struggled. And so I thought, I know people at home were struggling, but how could I come home and help them? And that was really my
Hmm.
big thing in the end.
Hmm. I couldn't there's so many aspects I relate. I remember, like, I worked in industry, worked in the mining. I come from a small remote community. I think majority are indigenous. And I worked in the mining industry, and I found people treated me differently than my peers. And I think I was, I think I could see that. Well, 6'3", 300 and some pounds, and I'm white passing. I still had I had a thick northern accent, I think, when I hit,
Mhm.
the industry or whatever. But there was, I didn't experience things the same way, and And I think that really drove me, and I hear a parallel in your story. It drove me, I didn't, I wasn't treated the same way. I grew up, and when I was younger, I grew up with a lot of people, a lot of my peers. We didn't see anyone any differently. But when I left town and I travel with some of my friends and whatnot, and they get treated differently. And I think in terms of, my own journey, there was a bit of shame there. But as I overcome that, and I thought, I'm going to do something about this, right? I feel no differently, but I'm getting treated differently. I have a different experience, and there's an opportunity to build off that, to leverage that privilege, the privilege that I had, and to be able to do that. And so, to hear that, to hear you having that experience, it should be inspiring for a lot of people, right? And so, in terms of service and giving back, and it's I think it's a little more common than we think, right? And so, and hopefully, it becomes even more commonplace because more people are doing, I think, more good things for our communities. So, no, I think that's I'll give you the last chance, the last word here. I think that's all the things that I wanted to prompt and all the time I wanted to take from you, but incredibly appreciative. Is there anything you want to leave with, the people listening in terms of, Isaiah nuggets of wisdom or anything like
Uh,
that? So,
Maybe I'll just do a shout out. I know I don't really have anything
hey,
to add,
that's all
but
right. Yeah.
please go to Walmart. We have Clem2 spirits there. It's made in
Yeah.
Clem2, Atlantic salmon. It's recognized. It's all sold at all in Walmarts and
Mhm.
metros in Canada, and we're hoping
Yeah.
to expand. So please enjoy it. Let us know, and we look forward to hearing from you.
I know personally I am. Absolutely. I'm actually pretty excited about that. So, no, it was an absolute honor, and thank you very much. And yeah, I'm hoping I know our paths will cross soon, hopefully sooner than later. So thank you very much, Isaiah.
Thanks, John.